Please just make it quick," she said. But the rancher lowered his gun and chose to save her. The sun was beginning to set on the wide-open plains, casting a soft golden glow across the land. The rancher rode slowly, his horse's hooves kicking up the dry dust of the trail. His name was John, a man of few words, whose life had been spent alone, working the vast land his family had owned for generations. He had grown accustomed to solitude, finding peace in the quiet rhythms of ranch life. But today, as the wind whispered through the tall grass, something felt different. John had been out riding for most of the day, checking on the cattle, making sure the fences were intact, and ensuring that everything was in order. He didn't mind the long hours. The work kept his mind focused, kept him from thinking too much. Out here in the open space there were no distractions, just the endless horizon and the work that needed to be done. As he passed a large rock formation near the edge of his property, something caught his eye. At first, he thought it was just a trick of the light, but as he drew closer, he saw her. A woman, sitting on the ground, her body slumped forward as though she had collapsed from exhaustion. Her clothes were torn and dusty, her hair matted from the long journey she must have endured. She looked as though she had been through a great deal, and yet she was still sitting there, her eyes half closed, as if waiting for something. John's instincts kicked in immediately. He reached for the rifle slung over his shoulder, his fingers brushing the cold metal. His hand tightened around it, but before he could pull it free, he saw her head snap up. Her eyes locked with his, and for a moment neither of them moved. "Please." Her voice was shaky, filled with desperation. "Just make it quick." The words sent a chill down John's spine. For a second he froze, unsure of what he had just heard. What kind of person would say something like that? Why was she so defeated? Was she in trouble, or was there more to her story than he could understand? The woman's eyes were wide with fear, her face pale and drawn. Basic. She looked as though she had been running for days, exhausted and broken. She didn't appear to be armed or dangerous, yet her words made it clear she had resigned herself to something awful, perhaps believing that the end was near. John's grip on the rifle loosened, but he didn't lower it right away. His eyes scanned the woman quickly, taking in her appearance. She didn't look like a criminal, and she certainly didn't seem to be a threat. But what had brought her here? Who was she, and why did she seem so certain that her life was over? For a moment, he thought about leaving, about riding away without looking back. After all, he didn't know her, and out here on his property, he was the law. No one was going to tell him what to do. But something in her eyes stopped him. He could see the fear, the hopelessness. He could see that she wasn't asking for death, but for release from a life that had been too much for her to bear. Slowly, John dismounted from his horse, his boots sinking into the dirt as he approached her. He kept his rifle at his side just in case, but there was no sign of immediate danger. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gruff, though he tried to soften it. The woman didn't respond at first. She simply sat there, her shoulders hunched as though she were carrying a weight too heavy for her body. After a long silence, she finally spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to go back." "I can't," she said, her voice trembling. "I don't know how much longer I can keep running." "Please, just make it quick." John could feel the pain in her words, the hopelessness. But he knew he couldn't just let her sit there in the dirt, defeated. He couldn't turn his back on her, not when she had clearly been through so much. "Who are you running from?" John asked, his tone still cautious but full of concern. For a moment, the woman's eyes darted around as though she feared someone might be watching. She hesitated before answering, as if the words were too difficult to say aloud. They're after me," she said, her voice breaking. "They won't stop. I don't know what else to do." John could see the tears welling up in her eyes as she spoke, her body trembling with the weight of her emotions.
Whatever she had been through, whatever danger she had escaped, it was clear that she was on the edge, hanging by a thread.
John took a deep breath, his hand still gripping his rifle, but now his mind was focused on the woman in front of him. He had never been one to get involved in the troubles of others, especially not when they were strangers. But something about her made him feel that he couldn't just walk away. "Come with me," John said, his voice steady but kind. "I'll take you back to the ranch. You can rest there, get something to eat, and we'll figure this out." "You don't have to face this alone." The woman looked up at him, her eyes filled with a mix of surprise and relief. It was as though she hadn't expected kindness, hadn't expected anyone to help her after all that had happened. Her lips trembled as she tried to speak, but the words didn't come. Instead, she nodded slowly, her shoulders sagging in relief. John helped her to her feet, guiding her to his horse. He didn't know who or what she was running from, but he knew one thing. She was no longer alone. And for the first time in a long time, he felt the weight of his decision, the responsibility of offering her safety. As they rode back toward the ranch, the silence between them was comfortable, as though the unspoken understanding had begun to bridge the gap between two strangers. In that moment, John didn't know what would come next, but he knew that he had made the right choice. The sunset faded behind them, and the long shadows of the evening stretched across the plains. There was something about the vastness of the land that made the world feel small. But here, in this moment, as the rancher guided the woman toward the safety of his home, it felt like the world had suddenly opened up to something new, something he wasn't ready to ignore. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting its golden light over the land, John and the woman made their way toward the ranch. The evening air had a cool bite to it, but it was still a welcome relief after the heat of the day. Bright. John kept his horse at a steady pace, his eyes occasionally flicking over to the woman who rode silently beside him. Her name, he had learned, was Emma, but there was a deep sadness in her eyes that told him there was so much more to her story than her name. When they reached the ranch, John led the horses into the barn, unhitching them from the reins and ensuring they were taken care of. He then walked over to the small cabin near the edge of the property, the same cabin he had lived in for years. It was simple, with only the essentials, no luxuries but enough to live a quiet life. Emma dismounted slowly, her body stiff from exhaustion, but she didn't seem to mind. She was still holding herself together, though John could see that her mind was far away. "Come inside!" "You can rest," John said, gesturing to the cabin. "I'll get you some food and water."
Emma nodded silently and followed him inside, her steps careful as though she wasn't used to walking on solid ground anymore.
John lit a lamp in the corner of the room, the soft glow filling the small space. The cabin smelled of wood and leather, the scent of years of hard work and solitude. He set to work immediately, making a simple meal, some stew he had made earlier that day, fresh bread, and water. It wasn't much, but it was nourishing. "Here, eat," John said, placing the bowl of food in front of her. Rasp. Emma looked at the meal as if it were something she hadn't seen in a long time, but after a moment she picked up the spoon and began to eat slowly. John watched her for a moment, studying her carefully. He knew she had been through something terrible, but there was still something about her that seemed distant, as though she was holding back the full weight of her experiences. "So, Emma," John began cautiously, "what happened to you?"
Who were you running from? Emma didn't answer right away. She took another spoonful of the stew, chewing slowly, her eyes focused on the food in front of her.
John waited, not wanting to rush her. She was in no condition to talk if she wasn't ready. Finally, after a long silence, Emma set the spoon down and wiped her mouth with the back of her hand. She met John's gaze, and for a moment it felt like she was trying to decide whether or not to trust him.
"I wasn't always like this," she began softly, her voice trembling as she spoke. "I wasn't always broken." John nodded, encouraging her to continue without saying anything more.
I grew up on a farm not far from here, Emma said, her eyes distant as if she were seeing a place far away. I was the youngest of 3, the only girl in the family.
My father worked hard to keep the farm running, but he was a kind man, always looking out for his family. My mother...
Well, she wasn't like him. She was always distant, never really there for us.
But my father, he taught me how to work the land. He taught me about the cattle, the crops, how to mend fences, and how to survive out here.
Her voice wavered as she spoke, and John could see the pain in her eyes. It was as though the weight of her words was too much to carry.
He knew there was more, but he didn't interrupt. Everything changed when I was 16, Emma continued, her voice quieter now, barely above a whisper.
My father died in a horrible accident. I was with him when it happened. After that, my mother, she didn't take it well. She started drinking more, and she became violent. It wasn't the first time she had gotten angry, but it was the first time I saw her lose control. I didn't know how to handle it.
I was just a kid, and now I was alone with her. John felt his heart sink at the thought of a young girl in such a helpless situation.
But he could only imagine how difficult it must have been for her. But there was more to her story. He could sense it, perhaps.
The worst part was that it wasn't just her, Emma said, her hands trembling slightly as she held onto her bowl. There were others, men who came around.
They'd show up when she was drunk, and they
were never kind to me.
I don't know how it happened, but I ended up living in a nightmare I couldn't escape from. John's throat tightened as he listened, but he didn't say anything. There was nothing he could say that would make this better, no words that would undo what she had been through. He only nodded slowly, acknowledging her pain, offering the comfort of silence, breaths. I tried to leave, Emma continued, her voice stronger now, though still tinged with sadness. I tried to run, but every time I did, they found me. My mother, she always called me back, told me I was being foolish, that I had to stay. But she never understood what it was like to live like that. She never understood how it felt to be trapped. John felt a knot in his stomach. Breath. He wanted to reach out to tell her that she was safe now, but he knew that her past couldn't just disappear.
It wasn't something that could be wiped away with a kind word or a warm meal. It would take time.
I finally made it out, Emma said, her eyes meeting his. I left everything behind. My home, my family, everything. I didn't know where I was going. Brave. I just knew I couldn't stay there any longer. But no matter how far I ran, they were always there. The fear, the memories. They followed me, and they never let me go. Breath. John sat quietly, listening to her words. He could feel the weight of her past, the ghosts that haunted her every step. She had been through more than any one person should have to endure, and yet here she was, sitting across from him, still standing. You're safe here, John said finally, his voice firm but gentle. No one's going to hurt you. You don't have to run anymore.
Emma looked at him, her eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief.
It was as if she couldn't quite believe that such a thing was possible, that there was someone who would offer her protection without asking for anything in return. She nodded slowly, but there was something in her expression that told John her journey wasn't over. She might be safe for now, but the past would follow her for a long time. It was clear that she still carried the weight of everything that had happened, and it would take more than just one night to heal those wounds. As they sat there in silence, the soft glow of the lamp casting shadows on the walls, John knew that he had made the right decision, but he also knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy for either of them. Emma had a long way to go before she could truly find peace, but for now she was here, safe in his home, and he was determined to help her every step of the way. The following days passed in a quiet, peaceful routine at the ranch.
John had never been one for much company, but there was something different about having Emma there.
The solitude of his life. Once something he cherished, now seemed incomplete without the small presence of someone else in the house. Emma had started to help around the ranch, doing the chores that were once John's alone. It wasn't much, feeding the animals, mending fences, and collecting firewood, but it gave her a sense of purpose, something she hadn't had in a long time. John watched her closely, noticing how the lines of fear in her face seemed to soften over time. Her movements became less guarded, more confident, and her once distant gaze had begun to warm with gratitude. The silence between them, once heavy and uncomfortable, started to feel natural. They shared a quiet understanding, a bond forged not from words but from the shared simplicity of ranch life. One morning John woke before the sun as he always did to tend to the animals. The chill of the early morning air was a relief, and the silence of the land, stretching far and wide, was the same as it had always been. He had learned long ago to appreciate the peace that came with the quiet of nature. But today, it felt different. It felt like the calm before a storm. As he walked past the barn toward the field, he noticed Emma standing by the fence, looking out at the horizon. Her shoulders were tense, her gaze fixed on something far in the distance. John approached her slowly, not wanting to startle her. He had learned that Emma was a woman of few words, and when she spoke, it was often after much thought. "Morning," John said, his voice calm but filled with curiosity. Emma turned her head slowly, offering him a small, almost imperceptible smile. "Morning," she replied, though her voice lacked the usual warmth it had gained in the past few days. Bah. John knew something was bothering her. She hadn't been her usual self lately. Her eyes were clouded with something he couldn't quite read. Worry, doubt, perhaps even fear. He could tell that the weight of her past was still very much alive in her, and that the peace she had found here was only temporary. The ghosts of her former life were still chasing her, even if they weren't visible to the eye. "Something on your mind?" John asked, his voice gentle but firm. Emma hesitated, glancing over her shoulder at the barn before turning back to face the horizon. "I've been thinking," she started, her voice trailing off as she struggled to find the right words. John didn't rush her. He could sense she was working through something difficult.
About what? He asked after a moment.
"About leaving," Emma admitted softly, the words almost a whisper in the morning air. John's heart sank at the sound of the word. He had known this moment would come. It was inevitable. Emma had always been a woman on the run, and now that she had found a place of safety, the fear of staying too long, of getting too comfortable, was creeping in. She didn't know how to trust that this peace could last. John didn't speak right away. He simply stood there, his mind racing as he thought about the weight of her words. He could feel his protective instincts kicking in. He didn't want her to go, not after everything she had been through, not after everything he had come to care for. "You don't have to leave," John said quietly, his voice unwavering.
"You're safe here." Emma shook her head slowly, as if she couldn't quite believe him. "I know you mean well, but I can't stay here forever, John."
"I've been running for so long I don't even know what it's like to stay in one place for too long." John's brow furrowed, and he took a step closer to her, his boots crunching in the dry grass.
"It's not about staying forever.
It's about finding peace, even if it's just for a little while.
You've been through enough. You deserve a chance to heal.
Emma turned her head sharply, her eyes meeting his. There was a flash of emotion in her gaze. Anger, frustration, but underneath it all there was a vulnerability that John couldn't ignore.
I don't know how to heal, John,
she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. I don't know how to forget everything that's happened.
John's heart ached for her. He had always believed that people could find their way if they were given the right space, the right circumstances.
But he also understood that healing wasn't always something that could be forced. It had to come from within. He stood there for a moment, not knowing how to respond, but finally he spoke the only thing he knew to be true. You don't have to do it alone, he said quietly.
I'm not asking you to forget what happened. I'm asking you to stay, to give yourself the time to heal, without the pressure of running or hiding.
Emma's lips trembled as she looked down at the ground, her fingers nervously twisting the fabric of her jacket.
I've never had anyone tell me that before, she said,
her voice barely audible.
John gently placed a hand on her shoulder, offering what little comfort he could.
You don't have to go anywhere.
Bay. Not today. Not tomorrow.
Just let yourself be for now. You've earned that.
The wind picked up slightly, sending a gust of dry air through the field. Emma stood still, her shoulders relaxing ever so slightly, but John could see that she was still wrestling with the idea of staying.
I'll think about it, Emma said quietly, turning her gaze back to the horizon.
She wasn't ready to commit to staying, but for the first time in days there was a flicker of hope in her eyes. John didn't push her. He knew that decisions like this couldn't be rushed. All he could do was offer her the space to make it in her own time, without pressure, without expectations. For the rest of the morning, they worked together in silence. Emma helped John with the chores, her movements more fluid now, as if the weight she had been carrying was lightening ever so slightly. But John couldn't help but notice the distance in her eyes, the conflict that still lingered beneath the surface. She wasn't ready to let go of her past, not completely, but he hoped that, with time, she would come to see that she didn't have to carry it alone anymore. That night, after dinner, they sat on the porch together watching as the stars began to appear in the sky. The ranch was quiet, save for the soft rustle of the wind and the distant sounds of the animals settling in for the night. Pressed, the world seemed peaceful, almost as if nothing could disturb the calm. "Thank you," Emma said quietly, her voice breaking the silence. John turned to her, his eyes softening.
"For what?"
"For letting me stay," Emma replied, her voice steady but filled with gratitude.
"For not making me leave. I didn't think I'd ever find a place like this."
John nodded slowly, understanding the weight of her words. He didn't need her to explain. He could see it in her eyes, the struggle, the fear of staying too long, the fear of being trapped. But now there was something else there, something that told him she was beginning to see that perhaps she didn't need to run anymore. "You're welcome," John said quietly. "You deserve to have a place where you can just breathe." As the stars shone brightly above them, John couldn't help but feel a sense of hope. Emma wasn't ready to fully let go of her past, but maybe, just maybe, she was beginning to see that she could find peace here. And that, he thought, was enough for now. Days turned into weeks, and Emma settled into the rhythm of ranch life. At first, it had been a strange and unfamiliar experience. She was used to constantly looking over her shoulder, wondering if someone would find her, or if she would have to run again. But here, on the ranch with John, the pace was slower. The work was hard, but it was honest, and the simplicity of it brought a sense of peace that Emma had never known. She began to find comfort in the small tasks, feeding the chickens in the morning, brushing down the horses, and helping John with the garden. At first, she felt awkward, as if she didn't belong. But over time, she grew more confident, learning the ins and outs of ranch life. There was something about the hard work that gave her a sense of purpose, something to focus on other than the past that she had been running from for so long. John, too, seemed more at ease with Emma's presence. She wasn't the same woman who had ridden onto his land weeks ago, defeated and broken. The woman he saw now was stronger, more resilient. She had a quiet strength about her, and although she still carried the weight of her past, she was beginning to heal piece by piece. One afternoon, after a long day of working together in the fields, John invited Emma to sit with him on the porch as the sun began to set. The air had cooled, and the golden light of the evening bathed the land in warmth. They sat in silence for a while, both of them watching the horizon as the world slowly quieted. "You've come a long way," John said, his voice low, his eyes on the distant hills. Emma glanced over at him, surprised by the words. "What do you mean?"
I mean, he began, turning to face her, you've found peace here.
Breath. "I can see it in the way you work, in the way you carry yourself. When you first arrived, you were lost. You were running, and I think part of you still is. But now, I don't see that fear in your eyes as much." Emma looked down at her hands, tracing the worn edges of the wooden chair she sat on. She had never thought about it like that. She had always been so focused on surviving, on making it through another day, that she hadn't realized how much she had changed since coming here. But John was right. She didn't feel the constant, overwhelming sense of fear anymore. The ranch had given her something she had been missing for so long. Stability. "I don't know if I'll ever be free of what happened," Emma said softly, her voice barely audible in the stillness of the evening. "But being here with you, it feels... Britt. I don't feel so alone." John smiled gently, the lines around his eyes softening.
"You're not alone anymore," he said simply.
For a moment they'd both sat there, the silence between them comfortable, not awkward. It was a silence that spoke volumes, one that said they had both come to a place of understanding. Emma looked up at the sky, her eyes tracing the fading light as the stars began to appear.
I never thought I'd be able to let my guard down, she confessed.
Desk. "I never thought I'd be able to stay in one place for more than a few days, let alone find peace." "You've got a lot more to give than you think," John said, his voice quiet but filled with certainty. "And you've got a whole life ahead of you. Don't let the past keep you from seeing that." For the first time in a long while, she felt like she had a future to look forward to. She had spent so many years running, afraid of being trapped by her past, that she had forgotten what it felt like to simply be. The next few weeks brought more changes. Emma found herself growing stronger, not just physically, but emotionally. She began to open up to John more, sharing stories about her childhood, about the things she had once loved before her world had turned upside down. She told him about her father, the man who had taught her everything she knew about the land, but wasn't easy for her to talk about. But little by little, she found herself remembering the good things, the laughter, the lessons, the love. John listened patiently, never interrupting, just allowing her the space to speak. He had a way of making her feel safe, like she could say anything without fear of judgment. And that made all the difference. One afternoon, while they were working together in the garden, John turned to Emma with a serious expression on his face. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice softer than usual. "I think it's time for you to make a decision." Emma stopped what she was doing,
her hands resting on the shovel as she looked up at him. What kind of decision?
About what you want, he said, his gaze steady.
You've been here for a while now, and I think you've had time to think about your future. You don't have to stay here forever, but if you want to make a new life for yourself, you can. Emma's heart skipped a beat. The idea of leaving the ranch, of stepping back into the world she had once fled, terrified her. But at the same time, there was something exciting about it. Something that made her feel like she was finally in control of her own destiny. I don't know if I'm ready to leave, Emma admitted, her voice tinged with uncertainty. But I don't know if I'm ready to stay here forever either.
John nodded, understanding her hesitation. You don't have to decide right now.
But I want you to know that whatever you choose, I'll support you. You've earned the right to choose what happens next in your life. For a long time, Emma stood there, the weight of his words settling in her chest. She had never felt so conflicted, so torn between two choices. But in the silence that followed, she realized something important. She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't afraid of the future. She could see a life for herself, whether it was on the ranch or somewhere else. That night, after dinner, Emma stood outside, looking up at the stars. She had spent so many years running, so many years trying to escape, that she had never really stopped to think about what she wanted: breath. Now, for the first time, she felt like she had options, like she could make a choice that would shape her future. John came outside and stood next to her, his presence comforting.
I'm not going anywhere, he said quietly. I don't want you to feel like you have to make a decision right away.
Take your time.
Emma looked over at him, a small smile tugging at her lips.
Thank you, John, for everything. You're welcome, he replied simply. Whatever happens, you've got a place here. You've always had one.
As the night grew colder, Emma felt a sense of calm settle over her.
She wasn't running anymore. She was here. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. The days continued to pass slowly, each one blending into the next like the gentle ebb and flow of the seasons. John and Emma settled into a routine on the ranch, but there was something different about their lives now. The air was no longer filled with the weight of uncertainty that had once haunted Emma. The peace of the land, the warmth of the home, and the simplicity of their lives had created something Emma never thought possible, a life where she could breathe without fear. But as time went on, Emma couldn't ignore the nagging thought that lingered in the back of her mind. Was this truly the life she wanted? She had come so far from the woman she had been, but the past, with all its pain and confusion, still followed her breath. Even in the quiet of the ranch, she couldn't completely escape the remnants of the fear that had been her constant companion for so long. The future seemed like a distant horizon, one that she wasn't sure she was ready to walk toward. One morning, as John and Emma were finishing breakfast, a sense of unease settled in the pit of Emma's stomach. She had been trying to push the thoughts aside, but they were becoming harder to ignore. She knew the time had come to make a choice, and the thought of leaving, of stepping away from the safety of the ranch, filled her with a sense of dread. She didn't want to go. She didn't want to leave the place where she had started to heal, but she also knew that she couldn't stay forever. The world outside the ranch was still out there, and Emma wasn't sure if she could stay hidden away forever. "John," she began, her voice steady but tinged with uncertainty.
I need to talk to you about something. John looked up from his plate, his eyes soft and attentive, always ready to listen. He had been patient with Emma, allowing her the time and space she needed to find her way.
But he could see the unease in her eyes today, the tension in her posture. He put down his fork and leaned forward, his expression serious. What's on your mind? He asked, his voice gentle but filled with concern. Emma took a deep breath, her hands resting on the table. Breath.
I've been thinking about leaving, she said quietly, the words hanging in the air like a heavy cloud. I'm not sure if I can stay here forever.
I've made progress, and I'm starting to feel like myself again. But I don't know if I can stay here and keep running from everything.
Breaking terror. John didn't immediately respond. Instead, he studied Emma's face, trying to understand the turmoil she was experiencing. He knew how hard it was for her to even consider leaving, but he also understood the deep-rooted fears that still held her captive. The idea of returning to the world she had fled from must have seemed terrifying, like facing an insurmountable obstacle. But he also knew that she had grown stronger during her time on the ranch, and part of that strength came from the choices she made.
"You've come a long way, John," said finally, his voice calm but filled with conviction. "I know how hard it is to leave the past behind, especially when it's been with you for so long."
"But you're not the same person you were when you first came here." Emma looked down at the table, her fingers tracing the edge of her cup.
I'm not sure who I am anymore, she admitted softly. For so long, I've only been trying to survive.
I don't know if I can just walk away from everything and start over. It feels like a dream, like I'm going to wake up and it'll all be gone. John leaned back in his chair, his eyes never leaving hers. You don't have to walk away from everything, he said gently. You're not leaving the ranch or the life you've built here. You're leaving the fear, the doubt, and the part of yourself that holds you back. Emma looked up at him, her eyes searching his face as if trying to understand his words. She had spent so much time thinking about her past, about everything that had led her to this point, that she hadn't fully grasped what John was saying. He wasn't asking her to forget her past or deny it. He was simply asking her to choose a future that didn't carry the weight of that fear anymore. I'm not telling you to make a decision right now, John continued, his voice steady. I just want you to know that whatever you decide, you're not alone.
You've got choices now, Emma. You've got a future to look forward to, and it's yours to shape.
You don't have to stay hidden away on the ranch forever, but you also don't have to face the world alone. Emma sat in silence, her mind racing as she thought about everything John had said. It wasn't that she didn't want to stay. It wasn't that she didn't care for the life she had started to build here. But something inside her told her that she couldn't stay in the comfort of the ranch forever.
She needed to move forward to find her place in the world beyond the safety of this quiet life. But how could she do that when the past was still haunting her?
I don't know if I'm ready, Emma whispered, her voice breaking. What if I fail? What if I can't do it? John stood up slowly and walked over to where Emma sat. He placed a hand on her shoulder, offering the comfort of his presence.
You don't have to do it alone, he repeated. You've already made it this far.
You've survived more than most people could ever imagine. You're stronger than you think. Tears welled in Emma's eyes, and for the first time in a long time she let them fall. She had spent so much of her life trying to keep it all together, to hide her emotions, that the release of her fears felt both terrifying and freeing. She didn't have to carry the weight of the past anymore. She didn't have to hide behind the walls she had built around herself.
I don't know what's next, Emma said, her voice trembling, but I know that I can't keep living in fear.
I can't keep running from everything. I have to face it, even if it scares me.
John smiled, his eyes filled with warmth and understanding. That's all any of us can do, he said quietly. Face it, one step at a time.
Narration. In the days that followed, Emma made the decision to stay, not out of fear, but out of strength. She had faced her past, confronted the ghosts that had been following her, and made a choice to build a future that was hers.
She wasn't running anymore. She wasn't hiding. It wasn't an easy decision, and there were still moments when the past tried to creep back into her mind. But each day as she worked alongside John, as she tended to the animals and as she cared for the land, Emma felt the weight of the past lift just a little more. She knew that she could never forget everything that had happened, but she didn't have to let it control her anymore. One afternoon, as Emma stood in the field, looking out at the horizon, she felt something inside her shift. She didn't know what the future held, but for the first time in a long time, she felt ready to embrace it. But she was no longer the woman who had come to the ranch, broken and lost. She was someone new, someone stronger, someone who had the power to choose her own path. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow across the land, Emma knew that whatever came next, she would face it with courage, with hope, and with the knowledge that she was no longer alone.